Dawn broke over Oahu on December 7, 1941, with a deceptive calm. Palm trees swayed in the soft Pacific breeze, and sailors aboard battleships in Pearl Harbor prepared for what they thought would be another routine Sunday morning. Then, the silence shattered. A roar grew from the horizon, the sound of engines bearing down. Within minutes, the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept across the sky. Bombs and torpedoes fell in rapid succession. The USS Arizona exploded in a fireball, its forward magazine igniting with a force that lifted the ship from the water before it split apart. Columns of smoke and flame climbed into the sky as oil fires spread across the harbor. Battleships burned, destroyers capsized, and sailors scrambled for survival in the chaos. To Tokyo's leaders, this was a hammer blow that would cripple America's Pacific Fleet and break its spirit. Japanese strategists believed the United States was too comfortable, too soft, and too unwilling to endure sacrifice. In their eyes, America was a nation of consumers, not fighters, a people with no appetite for a drawn-out war. Newspapers in Japan boasted that the attack had exposed the weakness of the decadent Americans. Officers in the Imperial Navy congratulated themselves, believing they had bought months, perhaps years, of unchecked expansion. But even as smoke continued to billow over Hawaii, the Japanese had made a fatal miscalculation. Instead of crushing American resolve, they had forged it. That very afternoon, stunned survivors wrote letters home filled with grief and anger. One sailor later recalled, "The flames weren't just on the ships, they were in our hearts. None of us doubted we would fight back." Across the continental United States, radio broadcasts carried the shocking news. Families gathered in silence around their sets, their disbelief giving way to fury. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress. His voice, steady but burning with conviction, declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. In just over 7 minutes, he transformed national shock into national determination. Congress voted almost unanimously for war. Only a single dissenting voice opposed it. Within hours, enlistment offices overflowed. Young men lined the sidewalks, some still in work clothes, demanding to be signed up. Women rolled bandages and collected scrap metal. Industry began shifting overnight. The Japanese High Command had assumed America would sue for peace or limit itself to a defensive war. Instead, the United States prepared for total war. Washington unleashed a mobilization effort unprecedented in history. Factories once producing cars, refrigerators, and farm equipment were already being surveyed for conversion to war production. Shipyards announced accelerated schedules. Aircraft manufacturers doubled their shifts. The sleeping giant, as Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto privately warned, had indeed been awakened. What Japan mistook for weakness was, in truth, a vast reservoir of strength waiting to be stirred. America's industrial potential was unmatched, its manpower seemingly endless, and its people now united by outrage. The battleships may have been crippled at Pearl Harbor, but America's aircraft carriers remained intact, and its factories on the mainland were untouched. The very tools Japan dismissed as symbols of decadence, cars, assembly lines, mechanized production, were about to become the engines of war. In the months that followed, posters proclaimed, "Remember Pearl Harbor," in bold letters. School children recited it, soldiers carried it, and families hung it in their windows. It was no longer just a harbor in Hawaii. It had become a national rallying cry. Japanese leaders, confident they had stunned America into submission, had in fact ensured the opposite. They had not destroyed resolve. They had crystallized it. Pearl Harbor was intended to be the opening act of Japan's dominance in the Pacific. Instead, it marked the beginning of a war in which America would commit its full weight, military, industrial, and spiritual. The fires of December 7th did not cow the American people. They ignited a determination that would spread from California shipyards to New York factories, from the wheat fields of Kansas to the jungles of Guadalcanal. Japan had gambled that America would falter, but by misreading its enemy, it had awakened a force that would fight island after island across thousands of miles of ocean until the rising sun was lowered in defeat. In the first months of 1942, the rising sun seemed to dominate half the world. Japanese forces surged across Asia and the Pacific with a speed that stunned both their enemies and their allies. The once proud bastions of Western colonial power fell in quick succession. Hong Kong surrendered after Christmas 1941. Manila fell in January. By February, Singapore, the so-called Gibraltar of the East, had capitulated, its defenders overwhelmed in one of the most humiliating defeats in British history. The Dutch East Indies, with its vast oil reserves, soon followed, completing Japan's conquest of a resource empire stretching thousands of miles. Everywhere the rising sun flag was hoisted, the same story unfolded. Japanese soldiers marched through city streets, their rifles gleaming, their discipline unshaken. Naval task forces ranged far and wide, striking Ceylon and the Indian Ocean, pushing deep into New Guinea and threatening Australia itself. To many observers, the empire seemed unstoppable. Tokyo's leader spoke openly of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, an empire that would replace Western dominance with Japanese rule. Inside Japan, newspapers trumpeted these victories as proof of cultural superiority. American weakness, they insisted, had been revealed at Pearl Harbor and confirmed by the rapid collapse of U.S. defenses in the Philippines. Japanese officers scoffed at the idea that a soft, materialistic nation could endure the kind of brutal sacrifices necessary for total war. One officer later recalled that the American soldier was regarded as a man who could not march without a car and could not fight without a machine. Yet this arrogance masked a darker truth. Even at the height of their triumph, Japanese forces committed acts that hardened American resolve. Prisoners of war, tens of thousands captured in the Philippines, Singapore, and Malaya, were forced into slave labor, often marched to exhaustion or confined in squalid camps. Survivors of the infamous Bataan Death March recalled the cruelty with searing clarity. Beatings, starvation, and the bodies of comrades collapsing by the roadside. Civilians, too, bore the brunt of conquest. In the Dutch East Indies and China, occupation policies stripped resources and imposed harsh control. For the peoples under Japanese rule, the co-prosperity sphere was often nothing more than exploitation by another master. At the same time, American industry was quietly shifting gears. While Japanese commanders congratulated themselves on their rapid victories, Washington and Detroit were laying the foundations for a war of attrition. The United States had not yet struck back in force, but the gears were turning. Shipyards launched Liberty ships by the week, and aircraft plants ramped up production. The arsenal of democracy, which Japanese leaders dismissed as decadent, was being forged into a weapon of unprecedented scale. Still, in early 1942, it was difficult for many to imagine how the tide could turn. Japanese warships prowled the Pacific with near impunity. Reports filtered back of Allied garrisons surrendering one after another. Families of soldiers captured in Bataan or Singapore waited in anguish for news that seldom came. For those on the front lines, the Japanese advance seemed endless. One British officer later wrote that the enemy moved with the certainty of a tide, everywhere at once, and nowhere vulnerable. But this very vastness concealed the seeds of weakness. The empire Japan had seized in 6 months was immense, stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands, from Manchuria to New Guinea. Holding such territory demanded fuel, shipping, and manpower that Japan could scarcely afford. Each new conquest added another burden of supply and defense. What had seemed like triumph was, in fact, overextension. And while the rising sun burned bright over captured cities across the Pacific, America's own awakening had only just begun. Its factories were gearing for war, its people rallied by outrage, and its leaders resolved to strike back. Japan's victories were real, but so too was its fatal miscalculation, believing that rapid conquest had broken an enemy whose strength was still gathering. By the summer of 1942, the tide of war in the Pacific began to shift. For 6 months, Japan had enjoyed uninterrupted victories, but that momentum soon collided with America's growing resolve. The first crack appeared in June in the waters northwest of Hawaii. Japan had planned an elaborate trap designed to lure what remained of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into destruction. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, believed that a decisive blow would cement Japanese supremacy. But in hidden rooms at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts had already cracked key portions of Japan's naval codes. They knew the target was Midway, a small atoll with little intrinsic value, but vital as a springboard into Hawaii. On June 4, 1942, carrier decks roared to life as U.S. planes clawed skyward. What followed was a battle of chance, courage, and timing. American dive bombers, finding Japanese carriers with their decks cluttered by fueled and armed aircraft, struck with precision. In a span of minutes, the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were engulfed in flames. Later that day, Hiryu joined them at the bottom of the sea. For carriers, the hard Japan striking power had been lost. One pilot recalled the sight as a wall of black smoke that blotted out the horizon. Midway was more than a tactical victory. It shattered the aura of invincibility surrounding the Imperial Navy. Japan could replace planes and pilots, but not the elite carrier air groups lost in that single day. For the first time, Tokyo was forced on the defensive. Its expansion halted. Yet this was only the beginning. Just weeks later, another battlefront opened. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal, a jungle-covered island in the Solomon Chain. For the Japanese, this airstrip, known as Henderson Field, was crucial to threatening Allied lines of communication with Australia. For the Americans, holding it meant preventing Japan from isolating the Southern Pacific. The campaign that followed descended into one of the most brutal struggles of the war. Marines dug foxholes into muddy ridgelines, listening for the eerie cries of Japanese assaults launched under the cover of darkness. Soldiers recalled nights where flares lit the jungle canopy and the rattle of machine guns echoed until dawn. One Marine later described it as a place where the nights lasted forever. At sea, the struggle was no less fierce. Battles erupted under moonlight and driving rain, warships exchanging fire at point-blank range. The waters around Guadalcanal became a graveyard of steel, littered with the hulks of cruisers and destroyers from both navies. Sailors began to call it Iron Bottom Sound. For Japanese troops on the island, the ordeal became one of starvation and exhaustion. Cut off from reliable supply lines, soldiers survived on handfuls of rice a day, scavenging for food in the steaming jungles. Many wasted away from disease and hunger before ever meeting the enemy in combat. Survivors later recalled the campaign not as a fight against the Americans, but against thirst, fever, and an empty stomach. Guadalcanal dragged on for 6 relentless months. By February 1943, the Japanese High Command ordered withdrawal, a decision unthinkable at the start of the war. The Island of Death had bled their forces dry. It marked the first major land defeat of the Imperial Army, proving that American soldiers and Marines would not only resist but prevail in the harshest conditions. Taken together, Midway and Guadalcanal signaled the turning point of the Pacific War. The myth of Japanese superiority had been broken. For the first time, America seized the initiative, forcing Japan to fight on ground not of its choosing. The empire's rapid advance had reached its limit, and now the long, grinding reversal had begun. By late 1943, the United States had seized the initiative in the Pacific. The victories at Midway and Guadalcanal had halted Japan's expansion, but the road to Tokyo remained long and perilous. America's answer was a bold new strategy, island hopping. Instead of grinding through every Japanese garrison, Allied planners selected key islands, bypassing others and leaving them to wither in isolation. Each captured island would serve as a stepping stone, bringing U.S. bombers and fleets closer to Japan itself. The first great test came at Tarawa in November 1943, a tiny atoll in the Gilbert Islands. It was barely 2 square miles of sand and coral, yet behind barbed wire, pillboxes, and reinforced bunkers, more than 4,000 Japanese troops awaited the assault. At dawn, Marines advanced in landing craft, but miscalculations about the tides left many stranded on reefs. Withering machine gun fire tore through the waves as men waded hundreds of yards under fire. Survivors recalled the sea turning red with blood. In just 76 hours, Tarawa was taken, but at the cost of over 1,000 Marines killed, a shocking toll for a single speck of land. From Tarawa, the U.S. advanced to Marianas. In June 1944, Saipan became the next objective. The battle revealed the ruthless resolve of both sides. Japanese defenders launched suicidal banzai charges, overwhelming U.S. positions in a frenzy of bayonets and grenades. But the most haunting scenes came not from the battlefield, but from the cliffs. As American troops advanced, civilians, indoctrinated to believe they faced torture at the hands of the invaders, leapt to their deaths by the hundreds. One Marine later recalled, "We tried to stop them, but they kept jumping. It was the most helpless thing I ever saw." The tragedy underscored not only the brutality of the war, but also the psychological grip of Japan's propaganda. The fall of Saipan was catastrophic for Tokyo. From its airfields, B-29 bombers could now reach the Japanese home islands. For the first time, the heart of the empire lay within the crosshairs of America's industrial machine. Yet the march continued. On Peleliu in September 1944, U.S. forces encountered a new kind of defense: deeply dug tunnels and hidden fortifications designed to inflict maximum casualties. Marines endured suffocating heat, jagged coral terrain, and sniper fire that seemed to come from nowhere. Water supplies ran short, and the stench of the dead filled the air. Though the island was secured after 2 months, many questioned whether the high cost had been worth its limited strategic value. Across each battle, the scale of America's resources became impossible to ignore. Waves of carriers escorted by destroyers filled the horizon. Liberty's ships brought tanks, ammunition, and supplies in an endless stream. For every aircraft lost, another rolled off the assembly lines in California or Kansas. Japanese defenders, cut off and undersupplied, fought with unmatched bravery but dwindling hope. As one captured officer admitted, "We destroyed their tanks, their planes, their men, but always there were more." By the close of 1944, the noose had tightened. Guam, Saipan, and Tinian now hosted sprawling air bases from which fleets of bombers took flight. The island-hopping campaign had shortened the war's distance, turning once remote atolls into forward operating bases. Japan's empire, once spread across vast swathes of the Pacific, was shrinking into isolated pockets of resistance. The strategy of island-by-island conquest revealed both the terrible cost of modern amphibious warfare and the inexhaustible power of America's industrial and human resources. What began as a desperate gamble at Tarawa had become an unstoppable march. The rising sun still flew over many islands, but the tide of history had shifted. The next step would bring the war to the very doorstep of Japan, where the stakes and the destruction would reach an entirely new scale. In October 1944, the promise made 2 years earlier was finally fulfilled. As waves of landing craft ground ashore on the island of Leyte, General Douglas MacArthur waded through the surf in his khaki uniform, declaring to the cameras and to history, "I have returned." For the people of the Philippines, long under the brutal grip of occupation, the moment carried deep symbolism. For the Allies, the campaign was far more than a gesture. Seizing the Philippines would sever Japan from the oil of the Dutch East Indies and choke off supply lines critical to its war machine. The campaign opened with one of the most ambitious amphibious operations of the war. Hundreds of American vessels crowded the waters around Leyte, disgorging divisions of soldiers under cover of naval guns and carrier aircraft. Behind them loomed the largest naval clash in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23rd to the 26th. It stretched across 4 separate engagements, involving more than 300 ships and hundreds of aircraft. Here, the Imperial Japanese Navy gambled everything in a desperate attempt to smash the invasion. The battles raged from the Sibuyan Sea to Surigao Strait. Japanese battleships, including the mighty Yamato, surged forward, determined to strike a fatal blow. Yet American submarines and aircraft sank 2 carriers and several cruisers before the decisive clashes even began. At Surigao Strait, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battleships, arranged in classic crossing the T, unleashed devastating broadsides, crippling the Japanese southern force. To the north, U.S. escort carriers and destroyers fought with near-suicidal bravery against a vastly superior fleet. One destroyer commander, seeing the overwhelming force before him, ordered a torpedo run he knew might not return. His crew later recalled the deck trembling under their feet as they charged into the storm of shells. When the smoke cleared, the Imperial Navy was broken. It lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, losses from which it would never recover. American sailors remembered watching with disbelief as Japanese ships, once symbols of power, turned and fled. The battle secured the beachheads on Leyte and marked the effective end of Japan's ability to wage fleet warfare. Yet, in their desperation, the Japanese unleashed a new and terrifying weapon, the kamikaze. On October 25, 1944, pilots from the Special Attack Units dove deliberately into American carriers and destroyers. One sailor remembered the surreal sight of a burning Zero coming straight down upon his ship. You could see the pilot inside. He never wavered. Then the sky turned white with fire. The attack sank or damaged dozens of vessels, killing thousands of men. Though tactically costly, kamikazes were a grim reminder that Japan had shifted from strategy to sacrifice. The fighting on land was no less brutal. Leyte's jungles and rice paddies became killing grounds as Japanese defenders resisted tenaciously. Flooded fields turned into quagmires, foxholes filled with water as soldiers fought under relentless artillery and air strikes. Filipino guerrillas, who had resisted occupation for years, now joined American troops, guiding them through terrain and harassing Japanese positions. For Filipino people, the liberation carried both relief and tragedy. Civilians, caught between advancing Allied forces and retreating Japanese troops, endured massacres, starvation, and displacement. Yet many described their joy at seeing American uniforms again, proof that MacArthur's vow had not been an empty promise. By December 1944, the Philippines campaign was far from over, but its outcome was already clear. Japan's navy was shattered, its airmen increasingly sacrificed in suicide attacks, and its grip on Southeast Asia fatally weakened. The campaign had proven that America's resolve, once doubted, was now unshakable. The road from Leyte would stretch across Luzon and Manila, but the tide of history had shifted irrevocably. Japan, which once dismissed America as a soft, materialistic nation, now found itself facing a foe willing to fight across every island, backed by a war machine that seemed inexhaustible. The Philippines had been reclaimed. The Pacific was narrowing, and the empire's end was drawing closer with every passing tide. In the winter of 1945, the Pacific War reached its most savage crescendo. The islands of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, mere stepping stones on the map, became crucibles of unimaginable suffering. To American commanders, they were essential gateways to Japan's home islands, launching pads of final assault. To the Japanese, they were the last bulwarks to be defended to the death. On February 19, 1945, the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima erupted under the boots of U.S. Marines. Waves of landing craft grounded ashore, disgorging men into a nightmare. Hidden artillery and machine gun nests poured fire into the beaches. The volcanic ash offered no cover, only sucking at the boots of exhausted men as they crawled forward under fire. A Marine later recalled that the island seemed alive with gunfire, every rocket death. The Japanese garrison, nearly 21,000 strong, fought from tunnels and bunkers honeycombing the island. They had orders to die to the last man. For 5 weeks, the Marines clawed their way across the island, each yard costing blood. Flamethrowers and satchel charges became the grim tools of survival. The air was thick with sulfur and smoke, the ground trembling from ceaseless bombardment. On February 23rd, a group of Marines reached the summit of Mount Suribachi, raising the stars and stripes over its crest. They created one of the war's most iconic images, a symbol of determination that carried hope across the Pacific and home to the United States. Yet beneath the photograph's triumph lay the grim truth. The battle was far from over. Fighting raged for weeks afterward. When it finally ended, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead, more than 19,000 wounded, and at the Japanese garrison, only a few hundred surrendered. The island was secured, but at staggering cost. Barely 2 months later, the U.S. launched the assault on Okinawa. At stake was an island less than 400 miles from Japan itself, a natural springboard for invasion. On April 1st, 1945, more than 180,000 American troops came ashore. At first, resistance seemed lighter than expected, but it was only a trap. The Japanese defenders, numbering over 100,000 soldiers, had prepared deep defensive lines in the south. The battle that followed stretched for 82 days, the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. American forces faced a storm of artillery, fortified caves, and fanatical resistance. Entire hills had to be blasted apart to root out defenders. A Marine described Okinawa as a land where the earth itself seemed determined to kill you. At sea, the U.S. fleet endured the fury of the kamikaze. More than 1,500 suicide aircraft hurled themselves at carriers, destroyers, and transports. Ships erupted in fireballs, their crews struggling desperately to save burning decks. The destroyer USS Laffey was struck by 4 bombs and 6 kamikazes in one attack, yet somehow survived. Sailors remember the horror of watching planes dive almost vertically, engines screaming, until they smashed into steel and flesh. By the campaign's end, more than 30 U.S. ships were sunk, hundreds more damaged, and nearly 5,000 sailors killed. On land, the civilian toll was staggering. Okinawan families were caught between advancing Americans and desperate Japanese soldiers. Many were forced into caves, where artillery blasts suffocated entire groups. Others were coerced into mass suicides by Japanese propaganda warning of American atrocities. When the battle ended in June 1945, Okinawa had become a graveyard. More than 12,000 Americans killed, 36,000 wounded, and over 200,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead. Japanese diaries and letters revealed despair and futility. One soldier wrote, "We are grass before the storm, trampled without end." Another simply noted, "There is no hope but to die." For the Americans, Okinawa was both a hard-fought victory and a chilling warning. If such slaughter came from defending 2 islands, what would an invasion of the Japanese homeland cost? Military planners estimated as many as 1 million Allied casualties. The ferocity of Iwo Jima and Okinawa stripped away the last illusions. Japan's leaders would not surrender easily, but their empire was bleeding out. For the United States, these battles confirmed that victory was near, but at a price almost too heavy to bear. As the Pacific Campaign closed in on Japan itself, the shadow of a new weapon loomed, one that promised to end the war without another Okinawa, but with consequences the world had never seen. By August 1945, the Pacific War had consumed nearly 4 years and left devastation across half the globe. Japan, once ascendant and confident, now lay broken. Its fleet, the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been shattered from Midway to Leyte Gulf. Its island garrisons, once symbols of conquest, had been reduced to silent graveyards. And its cities, Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima, lay in ruins, scarred by fire and ultimately by nuclear flame. The cost was staggering. Nearly 2.3 million Japanese soldiers were dead, alongside untold civilian losses from bombing, starvation, and displacement. America, too, had paid heavily. From Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, more than 400,000 U.S. servicemen never returned home, with hundreds of thousands more wounded. These figures spoke to the relentless grind of a war that neither side could escape, but which only one side could sustain. Factories in Detroit had built Sherman tanks faster than battlefields could consume them. California shipyards launched Liberty ships and Essex-class carriers with industrial precision. Across the Midwest, aircraft plants turned out B-29 superfortresses, the machines that would carry fire to Japan heartland. This industrial tide was not just about numbers. It embodied a nation's willpower, a unity of mechanics, farmers, women, and soldiers that Tokyo had fatally underestimated. Japanese leaders had believed that America was a soft, materialistic society, unwilling to bleed for victory. Yet from the black sand of Iwo Jima to the cliffs of Okinawa, American soldiers had endured suffering equal to any battlefield in history. One Marine recalled that every step across the Pacific felt like an eternity bought in blood. For Japanese survivors, the shock came in realizing that American endurance matched and often surpassed their own. A former officer later admitted that their greatest mistake had been dismissing not only American machines but the spirit of the men who fought with them. The final blows came in August. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki forced surrender, but in truth, Japan's fate had been sealed long before. The relentless island campaigns, Guadalcanal, Saipan, the Philippines, had already broken its capacity to resist. By the time mushroom clouds rose over Japanese cities, the empire's armies were starved, its navy gone, its skies dominated by swarms of American aircraft. The bombs ended the war abruptly, but the long grind of attrition had already written conclusion. The legacy of the Pacific War was carved into memory not only by its destruction, but by its lessons. For Americans, it confirmed the strength of unity, the capacity a nation once mocked as decadent to transform into an unstoppable force of war. For Japan, it was a lesson in the peril of underestimation, the recognition that arrogance and miscalculation can destroy even the most determined empire. In the years after, veterans from both sides reflected with awe and bitterness. American GIs remember the endless jungles, the beaches thick with smoke, and the sight of comrades who never returned. Japanese survivors recalled hunger, despair, and the realization that their leaders had gambled everything on a flawed vision. One soldier's diary, recovered after Okinawa, captured the futility. We believed they would tire. Instead, they only grew stronger. As peace returned, fleets of American carriers sailed past the shattered islands they had fought so hard to capture. Factories that once built bombers fell silent, their tools idle, their workers returned to lives that had been on hold for years. Yet the echoes of their labor lingered, for it was these mechanics, riveters, and welders who had built victory as surely as the men who stormed the beaches. The war in the Pacific was not merely a clash of armies and navies. It was a collision of assumptions and realities. Japan had dismissed American resolve, and in doing so, had awakened a force it could not withstand. The legacy was written in fire and sacrifice, a war decided not only by strategy, but by the will of the people who refused to yield.